Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Dracut Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Elizabeth Gonzalez James, and ASL interpreter Jasmine. Elizabeth is a screenwriter and best-selling author of the novels Mona at Sea and The Bullet Swallower, as well as the chapbooks Five Conversations about Peter Sellers. She has taught fiction writing at Grub Street, Pioneer Valley Writers Workshop, Story Studio, and elsewhere. Originally from South Texas, Elizabeth now lives with her family in Massachusetts. We're looking forward to what you're going to share with us today, Elizabeth. I am so glad you are here.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It's great, even after this winter storm.
Yeah, it was bitterly cold this morning, but it's warmed up to 20, so I think we're headed in the right direction.
Yes,
Boy,
definitely, definitely. So would you like to share with us today?
Well, I have a few different things. I thought I would start by reading a little bit from The Bullet Swallower.
I
okay.
love that book.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So should we get started?
Sure, please do.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So for people who haven't read it, The Bullet Swallower is a magical realism Western. It is loosely based on the true story of my great-grandfather, who was a bandito. And he got into a skirmish with the Texas Rangers, and he was shot in the face and left for dead, but he lived. And afterwards, people started calling him El Tragabalas, which is Spanish for the bullet swallower. And so I took that true story and turned it into a novel. And I think the novel asks the question, can we be better than our ancestors? Which is, to me,
Mhm.
the kind of foremost question that's maybe confronting Americans right now. So I'm just going to start reading a little bit from the beginning. I'm just going to start at the prologue, and this sets the stage. So how long should I go for?
As long as you'd like. We have an
Okay.
hour to listen to your wonderful works and talk about
Yes,
them.
Okay.
yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So this is the prologue. Like I said, we are in the fictional town of Dorado, Mexico, which is on the border with Texas, and it's the
Mm,
early 1800s.
mm,
Alferez Antonio Sonoro was born with gold in his eyes. The gold was sharp and it stung him so that he blinked uncontrollably and always carried a vial of salted water in his pocket. Of the
mm,
four Sonoro brothers, he was the only one thus signified, and his parents regarded it a blessing, incontestable proof of divine favor. Though he
mm,
was the youngest, the servants
mm.
carved his portion of meat first, even before his father's. His mother often knelt before him at night, delivering her prayers directly to her child rather than to God. The Sonoros lived in Dorado, a mining town established by their silk-clad forebears in the arid brushland fronting what the Texans called the Rio Grande, but which the Mexicans gave the more descriptive name Rio Bravo del Norte. A flock of clay-colored buildings studded with wooden vigas and decorated with dahlias drowsing in white pots, Dorado sat quiet and erect across the water from the wilds of the province of Texas, a 4-day journey upstream from where the river spooled emerald into the briny Gulf. Dorado, meaning golden, was both a wish and a command. The earth there was split apart by the Sonoros and her bounty revealed, and they took lustily. The pain in his eyes made Alferez Antonio unsympathetic. If I can stand it, he thought, anyone can withstand anything. And most people believed he'd been born with gold in his loins as well, for he lusted after more, more than he could spend, more than he could hold, more than could ever be dragged by the cartful from the belly of the earth. When Alferez Antonio stood in the sunlight, the gold gleamed white, and it was impossible for anyone to address him without averting their own gaze. Even his father, abandoning all pretense that he was master of his child, took to doffing his hat and holding it at his chest and looking at the ground one day, when his teenage son stood at the entrance to the mother lode and demanded to know why only grown men worked in the mine. Surely there are small pieces that women and children could gather, Alferez Antonio said. He kicked dirt at a small, club-footed child who'd stepped timidly forward, one palm open in supplication. We ride mares, the same as colts. We slaughter the fattest kid goats and cook them in their own blood. Why is it different with these Carrizo mongrels? His father watched the bare backs of the Carrizo tribesmen as they shuffled single file into the maw. 11,000 years of careful cultivation of the ungenerous earth, and for all their toil, they were now granted the license to squat on their own land. The Spanish outnumbered the Carrizos and had long ago forced them west away from the riverbanks because their God said to replenish the earth and subdue it. Their God granted them dominion over every living thing that moved upon the earth. The father turned his hat around in his hands as though he might find courage somewhere along the velvet trim. When the mine is yours, you may run it as you like, he said quietly, and with a tremor in his voice he added, but I caution you against working the Carrizos too hard. They will bend only so far. Alferez Antonio snorted, when will it be mine? And then, in a voice his father took to come not from the boy, but from God, added, you won't live forever. A lame horse can't run, the father whispered. When the father died days later, it was assumed throughout Dorado that Alferez Antonio had killed him, and like all news that is unpleasant and inevitable, the story was accepted, absorbed, and forgotten in one gulp. Mine work was presented to the Carrizos as an opportunity for advancement. Imagine closing your fist around your own centavos every week. The mine spokesman jingled change in his pocket and leered at the women as he strolled in pointed boots past their thatched roof jacales. Imagine your children liberated from the drudgery of tilling the fickle soil. Imagine the freedom to earn a wage and contribute to your family. A job in the mine is a hand reaching out to you. Grasp that hand and be free. The people listened to the man's speech with one eye trained on the spokesman's cronies, still seated on their horses, rifles pointing to heaven. Those who did not voluntarily enlist were rounded up the first day, herded to the mine entrance, and forced down into the bowels by Alferez Antonio's private militia. It took only 2 days for the first fatality, a boy of 5 who was skittering along a ledge to bring a lantern to his father, when his feet faltered and he plunged, the light illuminating his round face as he fell and fell, extinguishing on the rocks below. Soon, explosions rattled the plaster saints in Dorado's church niches and sloshed water over the round rims of clay ollas. Alferez Antonio was tunneling deeper and wider. Before, the mine had been worked by 300. Alferez Antonio would have 3,000 in his shafts, entire families outfitted down to the toddlers with hand drills and black powder. The mine spit gold out of its mouth with such regularity, it became known as La Fuente, the fountain. A bridge was hastily built across the river so shipments could travel north to San Antonio. Alferez Antonio oversaw construction of a new church in the center of Dorado, with the tallest bell tower north of Monterrey. He built himself a sprawling hacienda on the southern edge of town with white Roman columns and smaller adjacent structures for his brothers and their wives. He threw parties, served mountains of shrimp and shark fins he had packed in ice and floated up the Rio Bravo on barges from the Gulf. Over the next 10 years, he took one wife and then another and another, parading them through the plaza on Sunday evenings in their gauzy Regency gowns like 3 naiads. The people of Dorado swallowed their misgivings like bitter medicine topped with sugar. They danced at his parties, played faro in his cantinas until dawn, wore braided gold chains around their necks and cleared their throats, and changed the subject when the Carrizos loudly bore another of their dead through the streets, wailing and wringing their hands and clanging their bells. But in his early 30s, Alferez Antonio's eyesight began to fail. The gold had slipped from the edges of his irises and was now invading his pupils, clouding his vision. The pain woke him at night, and he'd stomp through the halls of his splendid home, glaring out the windows and between the columns at the dark fields and the dark mine beyond. Soon the workers were divided into shifts, and the mercury furnaces burned all night, rivaling the moon for their radiance. It was then that the Carrizo's descent began to grow tendrils, spiraling out and clutching legs as the men worked with rags tied across their faces, leading horses around circular patios to agitate a foot-thick slurry of gold, mercury, salt, water, and copper sulfate. 2 more girls dead, they whispered, and an old man, and everyone had the headaches, the weakness in their limbs. Mal aire, bad air, said another. No, it's the chemicals, said another, and he pointed at a young roan pushing through the slurry with knocking knees. They managed to lead the horse out of the patio before it collapsed dead. An overseer pushed the men aside and split open the animal's stomach with one flick of his large knife. He reached in up to his elbow and extracted a bloody lump the size of a mango. He demanded water, and once it was rinsed, the gathered men recognized it as an amalgam of gold and mercury, warmed in the humid oven of the horse's stomach. A strike was planned for the following week. Alferez Antonio heard the whispers. His spies knew the location of every meeting. The day before the strike, a sultry June morning, thick with impending rain, Alferez Antonio appeared before his workers and announced he was allowing them the day off, that they should rest with their families. Pickaxes were dropped, donkeys were left unloaded, and the Carrizos returned to their huts laughing and singing. Why, brother? The other Sonoros asked. The Carrizos will grow indolent. Next, they'll expect us to rub their calloused feet. And Alferez Antonio laughed. You're exactly right, he said. That night, the Carrizo men were meeting in a cypress grove to list their demands. Alferez Antonio waited for his spies to ride back with word that the meeting was underway, and then he dispatched his men to the Carrizo shanties to round up all the women and children. Drag them by their heels, he said, every last one. There was a defunct vein and a series of stopes along the northern edge of the mine, and they were deposited there, shoved at gunpoint down into the hole. When the Carrizo men returned to their huts, Alferez Antonio himself was waiting to tell them exactly where their wives and babies were. Everyone in Dorado sat up in their beds at the screams of the Carrizo men as they tore through the brush to their families. The men stormed down into the warm earth, their families blinking up at them out of the blackness. Everyone spoke at once, everyone had a plan, and no one heard Alferez Antonio's men strike their matches, nor the hiss of the fuses. The explosion sealed the exit behind 10 meters of rock and created a wave of dust and debris that blew the Carrizos deep out underground and smothered the most fortunate. Alferez Antonio swallowed the last drop of golden añejo in his glass and watched with satisfaction as the smoke from the explosion rose under the full moon. He was about to turn to his lieutenant and order the man to ride to Agualeguas in the morning and recruit a new corps of workers. Tell them, he was about to say, what happens to agitators in La Fuente. But as he opened his mouth, the ground beneath him began to shake. The explosion on the north end had worked loose the supports along the western edge of the lode. Beams snapped, tunnels caved. The moon was white as an egg, and in its glow, Alferez Antonio watched whole trees sink and disappear. The shaking grew more violent and was accompanied by great explosions as the methane gas trapped underground flooded and lit every artery. The new bridge collapsed into the turgid river that sloshed over its banks and dampened the homes fronting the water. In town, the people left their beds and ran out into the streets and looked up at the new church steeple rocking side to side before falling to the ground and shattering. In Laredo, Texas, 3 days' journey by horse, the shaking rang the bell at San Agustin Church. The moon disappeared behind smoke and dust. North of the mine, where the Rio Bravo had peacefully carried silt and rainwater for millions of years, the explosion caused the river to split into two, to fork like lightning, and then rejoin itself past Alferez Antonio's big white house at the southernmost edge of the Sonoro lands. Within minutes, Dorado became an island, as though the river had spread its legs and delivered the town, now long and liver-shaped, and as disconnected from Mexico as it was from the United States. The rocky bluffs of Texas rose undisturbed, like a sleeping leviathan on the other side of the water. Dorado was a land without a country. When the sun rose and Alferez Antonio could see what remained of La Fuente, he felt as though he'd slipped away somewhere else, had been plucked by giant fingers and deposited into a foreign land. So unrecognizable was the terrain that appeared in the purpling dawn. The mine hadn't simply collapsed, it was no longer there. A waterlogged crater 5 kilometers wide spread before him, a shallow hole that had swallowed every horse, every rock, every tree, every shovel, and left behind a barren depression as though crushed under an enormous boot heel. His eyes burned, and his heart felt torn in two, for it wasn't his wives he loved, or his children, or even the gold. It was his power for which he now grieved. He knew he would never again be able to take unquestioningly. His freedom and his privilege were trapped underground with the Carrizos, buried under kilometers of strata. He envied them even as he hated and blamed them. Their dirt-stained hands had managed to reach up out of the ground and clutch tight to his ankles, fixing him forever to the spot, like an old Russian story he once heard about a soldier who'd been dared to thrust his sword into a grave. He rode his horse through the Sonora lands, which now comprised the bottom 3/4 of the island, to where the river reconverged. He watched the rushing water carry away the last of the trees that only yesterday had stood on dry land. So it is, he thought, and spat on the dirt. He had ruled the town, and now he would rule an island. And he took some consolation in knowing his will had been strong enough to bend a river. His fury had remapped the earth. But the townspeople were disgusted by what Alferez Antonio had done, not least because their maids and ranch hands had been cousins of the Carrizos and had packed up their rosaries and their Sunday shoes and fled, claiming they couldn't hear themselves think for the whispers of the dead begging for a candle or a prayer. Children threw rocks at Alferez Antonio and his wives when he took them for a stroll. More than once he awoke to find cow's blood smeared on the white columns of his home. The Sonoro brothers fought. One brother's house was burned to the ground, another dropped dead into its caldo, and the third became convinced his wife favored Alferez Antonio, and he strangled her with a curtain tie. Nephews and nieces washed up dead on the banks of the river. Alferez Antonio continued to live in the White House even after scorpions invaded the library, nesting in Cervantes and fighting atop the yellowed writings of Sahagún. He closed the rooms he did not need, and his world shrank. One of the wives he buried in the garden after she choked on a fishbone. Another ran away after a violin salesman. But the third stayed, dutifully producing children and grooming them for their eventual return to moneyed society. This wife died in childbirth on her 40th birthday, a squirming baby girl at her breast. The girl was named Perla, and perhaps owing to her hand in her mother's death, the girl grew up sickly and fearful, certain every sneeze portended doom. Alferez Antonio was nearing 60 when his daughter Perla was born. His other children had grown and gone, but not before they dragged off as much of the family's dwindling fortune as they could carry. When Perla was a young girl, she could see the faded rectangles of paintings that had once cluttered the walls. Dust outlines where once rested fauteuils and tufted ottomans, glass cabinets emptied of their Chinese figurines. At 20, she married a distant cousin who promised he could repair the cracks in the white walls and reclaim the books from the scorpions, though he always found excuses to be away from the house, and meanwhile pigeons roosted in the bedrooms. When Alferez Antonio awoke one morning crying that he could not see The gold had finally pierced the nerves and blotted out the last lights of the visible world. Perla ran screaming through the brush that now surrounded the White House and into town for the doctor. But the old man died before she'd even closed the heavy oaken door of the main house, expiring with a cough and a whimper. His last thought, just a single word, repeating like one key struck again and again on a piano, mine. Perla hung black cloth over the mirrors, stopped the clocks, and refused to eat anything but bread and water for a month. That year, 1864, the year Napoleon III installed the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian into the Mexican presidency, Perla's son was born. She named him Antonio Sonoro, her priceless child. After Perla had banished the doctor, the maids, and her cousins from the room, afraid they would breathe impure air into her son's delicate lungs, she nursed her infant. And watching her from a chair in the corner and jiggling his foot in angst and anticipation, unseen and unheard by the doctor, the maids, the cousins, and most of all, Perla, sat Remedio. Remedio had been to the house several times before to make a collection, a young man who had pleaded with him, a young woman who had sobbed, and an old man who had laughed and shaken his defiant fist in the direction he presumed to be heaven. Perla used her fingertips to brush black hair from the baby's forehead, and Remedio got to his feet, no longer able to sit still. The only indication that he moved across the room was a slight disturbance in the uniformity of the air, his presence as easily blinked away as an eyelash. I don't understand, Remedio said aloud, standing behind the woman and staring down into the grass-green eyes of the newborn. He's done nothing. He knows nothing. What if he lives his entire life virtuously? There was, of course, no answer. Perla began to sing to her child. Antonio stopped suckling. He looked up at his mother, neither of them aware of the shadow behind her headboard, the edges of which vibrated slightly in agitation. Though the baby was scarcely 10 minutes old, there in his mother's arms and bathed in the warmth of her love, he smiled. Remedio walked around the room and tried again, though he knew his arguments were futile. Look at him. How can someone so young be assigned such a fate? That's not justice. It's little better than chaos. The baby began to cry, and Perla put him on her shoulder and patted him gently on his back until his lids dropped. In another moment, Perla was asleep as well, and Remedio thought the mother and child looked as still and posed as if Filippo Lippi himself had painted them onto the landscape of the bedchamber. I won't do it, Remedio said, taking one last look at the baby and putting on his hat. Men and women were marked for hell every day by their own iniquitous hands, their misdeeds open around them and touching everything like a spreading tide. But this was the first time Remedio had ever been sent for a baby. Strike me down if you will, he said, but I won't do it. He left the house through the front door and walked down the path that led to the Rio Bravo. A day, a year, a lifetime, viewed from up high, the movement of time held as little significance as the rotations of distant galaxies. He would return, he was duty-bound for that much, but only he would decide when. Thank you.
That's so evocative.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've read that because I was on book tour like 2 years ago now, and so it's fun to hear to kind of hear it again. Yeah. So pivoting a little bit.
Well, how did you choose magical realism for this particular story?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Do you always do?
I just thought it would be cool. Is basically my answer. I wish I had a better answer, but I just wanted to do it. I knew that I was going to write a story set along the border, and growing up there myself, I grew up in Laredo, which is on the border with Mexico. It the storytelling traditions that I remember from being a kid tended to skew a little dark, first of all, but also fantastical as well. Stories about exorcisms and ghosts and things like that. And so it felt natural to me to write into that. And I think it's not, magical realism isn't a genre, it's more of a mode. And I think it's
Yeah.
a mode that I will return to in the future, but not maybe not necessarily in this same way.
Well, it really, really works in this case, so good for you.
Thank you. So I thought for the next thing I was going to read, I just had a short story come out in the Indiana Review last summer. So I thought this is very different. So I'm working on a series of short stories where I revisit children's book characters, but at the age of 40. And
Oh,
this has been
wow.
enormously fun to do. I've only written three, but I plan to do like a lot. Because I'm a huge children's book fan and I have many favorite characters, and I have two kids too. So I've also just gone through another, 10 years, whatever, of reading these books to my kids. So I don't know if you remember the story of the three little kittens who lost their mittens.
Oh, yes.
Okay, good. So this is the kittens at 40. And there will be a little bit of language in this. So it was Argus who lost the mittens, the dim cunt. And when I say lost them, I mean he sold them to the old pervert who lived on the corner and used to gorm at us all day with his glass eye. Traded them to him for a slice of apricot cake so the dirty old slag could sniff them and rub them all over his face and do God only knows what. Argus traded them, gobbled up the cake himself, with no thought for Prissy or myself. And yet, when we turned up at home, mittenless, cold-bitten, Argus with cake crumbs and apricot jam positively sliming his flat face, do you suppose our mother confined her punishment to the offender only? The three of us couldn't sit for a week. And afterwards, Prissy and I got a lecture, a tired one by that point in our 7th year of life, about how Argus couldn't help being a dim cunt, and that we were as dim and as much cunts ourselves if we couldn't see that fact and attend to it. They were very nice mittens, white with little red snowflakes embroidered all over, and I burned to think of them in that pervert's greasy hands. But how to get them back? To break in was a remote possibility, as everyone knew he kept a shotgun behind the front door. He said as much once a week, in fact, and brandished the thing almost as often. And slightly more harrowing was the neighborhood legend that he had a box of macabre souvenirs cut off the bodies of other would-be trespassers under his bed. I loudly cast doubt upon this story whenever it was shared in earshot, though I secretly thrilled at the potential of its existence and yearned to see it for myself, lift the lid and glimpse whatever might be inside, ears and noses to be certain, and given that it was the pervert we were talking about, likely much more intimate and unmentionable things besides. I thought about it for a week and finally came up with a plan for the rescue of the mittens and retrieval of the box. If I was risking my life for one, I reasoned I might as well risk it for all. Prissy was to go to the pervert's door first, knock, and ask for a slice of cake. She'd wear the pair of frilled ankle socks Mother had recently mended, and if the pervert insisted on a trade, would offer up one of the socks. While this negotiation was taking place, Argus would throw a rock through the pervert's kitchen window. The glass would shatter, the pervert would run inside to see what had happened, and at that point I would dash in, run to the bedroom, and seize my spoils. It was a flawless plan, and when we rehearsed it, Prissy and Argus assured me they understood what they were to do with perfect clarity. I drilled hard on Argus. Are you sure you understand? I reiterated. I'll be watching from the juniper bush, and I'll throw up my hand like this, and I put up 3 fingers straight in the air, unmistakable to anyone with eyes. And then you let it rip. Yes, said Argus. Yes, yes, yes. Well, as I said, he was a dim cunt, and I even more of one for trusting him to do any damned thing the way it ought to have been done. He threw a rock all right, square at the pervert himself, clipping him on the ear. The man went behind the door and returned bearing the shotgun, and I can only credit my youth and foresight for the speed with which I ran out from behind the bush and tackled him. Prissy joined me, for though she won't do a thing until she sees someone else do it first, once in on a scheme, she's a devoted ally. I punched and kicked, and she scratched and bit until he dropped the shotgun and was quite overpowered. He begged us to leave him alone and even cried, asking us why we wanted to pick on an old, half-blind mail carrier who'd lost all his family in the war. We hate you, we responded. Give us our mittens and get the hell out of our neighborhood before we set your house on fire, you greasy pervert. Even Argus had joined at this point, continuing to throw rocks from a little distance, though he hit Prissy and myself as often as he hit the pervert, and I told him to knock it off and go inside and find some rope. Satisfied the pervert was sufficiently beaten and wouldn't put up a fight, we tied him to the wrought iron chair that sat on the porch. Leaving the others as guards, I went into the house. I remember being impressed at how quite ordinary it was, not nearly the house of horrors I'd been promised by neighborhood gossip. He had the same tea kettle we did, in fact, with the same felt rooster cozy sitting cockeyed atop it. But no matter. I would find the box of souvenirs and would soon know for a certainty whether the pervert was a mutilator in addition to a sex pest, as well as ascertain for some inner purpose of my own how much of a stomach I had for cruelty, whether I was as delicate as I feared or as unflappable as I longed to be. The pervert's bedroom was at the back of the house, past 2 guest rooms made up in blue and pink patchwork quilts respectively, a little blue and white bathroom that smelled recently cleaned, and a linen closet that regrettably held nothing in the way of body parts. The air in the bedroom was different to that of the rest of the house, however, portentous, dreary, and freighted with something I registered in my youth as a mix of regret and malice. I rifled through the closet and found our mittens in a drawer containing a perfect miscellany of children's clothes, shirts and belts and sun hats and, I shuddered then and now, underclothes, and I put them in my pocket and went on my stomach to look under the bed. To my astonishment, there were a great many boxes there, 3 or 4 dozen, I should think, and I had to catch my breath a little before I could gather the courage to open one and peek inside, for what is seen cannot be unseen, as we all know, and I wish to credit my young self a bit, as it was my innate understanding of this fact that forestalled my hand. It was true what the pervert had whined about his family and the war. They'd all died, mowed down and chopped up and scattered on the grass like fertilizer. But then everyone lost family in the war, our own father being now worm food, I'm told, somewhere north of Darien. And none of us were rumored to have a box of human penises in our bedroom. I heard once, and this was hearsay I caught while malingering around the bus stop, picking up cigarette butts with a few drags left in them, one old timer say to another, it was a pity the way the pervert was done by folks, and that before the war, he'd been a different man. Up his arse, the other replied, and he left it at that. I pulled one box toward me, an innocuous Florsheim logo scrawled across its top. It was heavy, and I shook it a bit, and the contents seemed both soft and weighty, so I imagined it might be filled with several pounds of dried apricots. It smelled a bit of pig. I was about to open it when a shadow covered me. Looking up, the pervert towered above, bleeding and sweating, and his glass eye dangling garishly out of its socket. He lunged at me with blood-black sausage fingers, and in my recollection, the tips were open to the bone, so that he seemed to have risen from the dead only to kill me. What he'd done to Argus and Prissy out on the porch, I could only hope at that moment with a violence as swift as it was depraved. I shot up with the box in my hand and aimed it at his chest, crashing into him him with my whole body and knocking him again to the floor. I ran out of the house and ran all the way home and was terrified for the third time that day when, reaching the driveway, Prissy and Argus leapt out of a hedgerow and accosted me with shrieks and kisses, as they'd as much given me up for dead as I'd them. We told our mother nothing, of course, save that we found the mittens and promised solemnly never to lose them. She had a hard nature made harder by circumstance, and she whipped us again for having lost them in the first place, but afterwards let us share a pot of jam she'd stolen from the old racist whose house she cleaned on Thursdays. We stayed close to the house for several days, a bit world-weary after our adventure, but Mother eventually needed cigarettes, and so we, by necessity, walked past the pervert's house on the way to the store. We saw his bald head through the kitchen window, bobbing over the stove. I looked at him only a second, and yet that damned man must have had eyes on his cheek, for he turned around the instant we were in front of his house and screamed at us through the glass. "Pig children," he shouted. "Thugs! Monsters!" We ran off for the cigarettes and ran all the way back, not wanting to give the pervert another chance to catch us. And lying in bed that night, I kicked myself, as I had every night since our break-in, for not having opened even one box. I was a coward, and my punishment was now to know that, and only that, for a certainty. I awoke the next morning to a terrific smell of smoke. Argus and Prissy were already at the window, and when I joined them, I saw an evil black plume rising above the trees down our street. It was the pervert's house, I was soon to learn, burned to the ground with the pervert in it. Argus, Prissy, and I exchanged looks, remembering our promise to dispose of the pervert in exactly that fashion not 1 week before. The investigator said the pervert had fallen asleep with a lit cigarette in his hand and had erased himself and all traces of his existence in a matter of hours. "The extraordinary devil!" I exclaimed at finding this out. This proved everything. He'd been a butcher, exactly as everyone had said, and had burned the house to remove all evidence of his crimes. This plainly observed fact soon became biblical truth within the neighborhood, and for years the retelling was followed up with a cry of good riddance and a healthy hawk of phlegm on the ground. I grew up, not that I had any say in it, as did Prissy and Argus. The pervert was forgotten as the yuppies gradually took the neighborhood. Mother died of emphysema. The bank possessed the house. Prissy married an idiot, and Argus makes prank videos on the internet. But lately, I find myself turning back to that chapter of our childhood, a circumstance to do with my late recollection of exactly what it was the pervert shouted to us that day in his kitchen, the last time any of us were to see him. After hurling his insults, he pointed to me in particular. The memory now sends a chill of guilt and dread through me, and shouted, "Only fools and bigots are certain. Certainty is the corrosive of reason." His words meant nothing to me then, meant nothing to me for 3 decades, until I was washing the floor of the bar where I'm employed and saw a chicken leg lying on the asbestos tile, nibbled down to the bone on one side, and I was instantly 7 years old, cowering before the pervert in his bedroom, his final judgment there in my head as though he stood behind me and spoke it directly into my ear. And I confess with some shame that even now I don't know how to countenance his words. On their face, yes, they seem to be true, and yet what am I to make of a man who traded a slice of cake to a dim-wit child for 3 pairs of mittens? Doesn't this action beg of a motive that, if not malicious, is at least more than a little askew? I'll admit to a bit of a personal stake in his payback, owing to the fact it was my hide that got tanned on the trade. But ignoring that, there was undoubtedly something wrong with the man. Else, why would the entire neighborhood know him colloquially and in perpetuity as the pervert? I never even knew his real name. No one did. No, there was something needing correcting in him, some injustice done that deserved to be righted. My motives were pure, I'm sure, on the whole. And let's not forget, I was 7. I can hardly be called to account for a moral foundation that hadn't yet fully formed. And yet, I lie awake now in bed with a cigarette in my mouth, as I imagine the pervert did, and ask myself whether we killed him, drove him to it with our invasion. And I spin round and round the question and light another cigarette and put it very, very carefully out in the ashtray, lest my untimely death add any more irony to a world already too full of it. And I think the pervert was wrong. For in my life, uncertainty has been the corrosive of reason. It is uncertainty keeping me awake now, night after night. Uncertainty as much about myself as him, still smarting for allowing the mystery of those boxes to grow and multiply inside my imagination until I'm sure there were more things contained in them than could ever have been known. I believe if I'd opened a box, somehow there'd be another box open inside it, and my very self looking up out of it. I look now into the dark, past the burning red embers of my smoke, and I regret I can't see anything out there. Nothing at all.
Wow.
Thank you.
Oh, wow.
A little bit different.
Oh, wow. Really fun, but also really horrible.
Well, it's not at all what I expected from the three mittens.
Yes.
Yeah.
But still, yeah, but what a plane to take off from.
Yeah. I had pneumonia when was it? Fall of 2024, and I was really, really sick. And I had just started to recover. The antibiotics had just started to kick in, and I got the opening lines of that story in my head, and I wrote the whole thing
Oh,
like on my phone. This never happens to
wow.
me, but it happened with this story. And so yeah, I think some of this I can attribute to the pneumonia.
Did you type it on your phone or did you speak it and have, translation
Yeah,
to text?
I just typed it into the notes app.
Wow. You must be a good typist on your phone then.
I'm a millennial. I've had a little bit of time.
Right.
Okay.
When you said that, I thought of how my daughter types on her phone too, and I just, nope, slow, very slow.
Hmm.
Wow.
If you don't mind, would you mention the other two stories for which you wrote, children's stories for which you wrote similar or whatever short stories?
Yeah. I have one coming out in a magazine called The Fabulist later this year about Harold and the Purple Crayon. So
Oh,
that's
Oh,
Harold at
wow.
40. And
Oh, wow.
and then I have another one. It's not finished yet, but if you ever read those like Little Miss Sunshine, Mr. Loud, do you remember those books at all?
No, sorry,
Um,
no.
they were really popular in the 80s, and then they came back because my kids had them as well. They're called the Mr. Men Little Miss series by Roger Hargreaves, who is a British author. Anyway, I have a story I'm working on called Little Miss Clever at 40. And she's not so clever. She's not
Oh,
quite as clever as people told her she was when she was younger.
yeah.
wow.
That's an interesting twist on it too, right? Because people attribute things to you and either you don't live up to them or they aren't really who you are.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah, and in my experience, being told when I was younger that I was like gifted and mature, actually, and smart, I think they wanted in the 80s to boost everybody's self-esteem and like
Uh,
love that. But the problem with being told that you're clever and mature when you're young is that when you eventually make really dumb decisions, you
oh,
don't know that they're dumb. You think that you can't make dumb decisions because you are so clever and so mature. And so clearly, um, like getting blackout drunk and jumping off of a roof to impress your boyfriend is like the smart thing to do because you're so smart. Why would you do a dumb
uh,
thing? And
uh,
it wasn't until much, much later that looking back, I was like, I was not actually that smart or mature, and it probably would have helped me if people hadn't drilled that into my head so
mm.
much.
Yeah, perspective is very interesting. I homeschooled my kids and I told them that they were smart and they didn't believe me. And then they got into the public with other people and they saw, oh, Mom wasn't kidding. She wasn't
Mm,
just building us up. But yeah, it's as parents, we always want to tell our kids how great they are and how good they are, and really
mm,
appreciate them so that they can grow into it. You're
Hmm.
right. Sometimes you make an assumption that isn't really true then, or else you don't quite know how to grow into that image that people have of you, you know.
Hmm. Yeah, there's having had my own kids, I just think it's you can get it as right as you can, but there's no way to get it right.
yeah, yeah. Yes.
Uh, how old are your children?
15 and almost 13.
Oof.
Those are hard years.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's they're still a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, that
That's
doesn't
good.
change.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But I think junior high years are like the hardest because
Mm,
what I saw was that my kids were really excited and ready to go learn certain things, but actually on an emotional level, but actually on an intellectual level, they weren't ready, and
mm,
it's those junior high years that for people who haven't been able to get to a certain point, it's the time where they can catch up and really land in basic knowledge. But if you have that all, it's a hard holding pattern because you can't go into trigonometry. You can't go into all these advanced things, but you're thirsty. You're so thirsty. And we just wound up going more deeply into certain things. Like we went off and made tons of rockets and shot them in the air. And we went to a fish hatchery and helped the scientists with the collecting of the eggs and then fertilizing them and putting them into different categories. But it wasn't advanced science. It was just lab work, right? And because she wouldn't have gotten the advanced science, and my son wouldn't have either with the rocketry. But doing those things and exploring was really, it showed them that they could explore and that they were still smart without really challenging the fact that they weren't ready for anything else.
Hmm.
And that's hard. That's hard. I think of how apprenticeships used to be at that age too, and people used to be masters by 17 or 18, and our society just isn't ready for that now. We don't have the ability to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a really, really prolonged adolescence, and I both support and don't support that. I think that kids can do a lot more than what they're able to do typically. But then also the world is so tough that I also understand the instinct to shelter them for as long as possible and keep them, kind of like cosseted and like, oh, you don't need to worry about that yet.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a very hard. That's why I said those are the tough years.
Hmm.
But that's neat. So, what made you think of doing the fairy tales as a 40-year-old?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember what inspired it necessarily. I just usually my authorial decisions come down to that would be cool. I should try that. I don't know. Yeah,
yeah.
I haven't
Mm,
seen that yet.
yeah.
That's a great thought. That'd be cool. I wonder what it looks like. And then going forward,
Hmm.
Mm.
what a great idea. Yes. Well,
So we have about 8 or 9 minutes left. Do you have something short that you could read or something you would like to discuss briefly?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can read a little bit of I'm working on a new novel. I'm
Oh, cool.
trying so hard to finish it. And the days just keep somehow getting past me, but I'm hoping to finish it very soon. And it's actually taken from material that I that I cut from the Bullet Swallower, but it's not a sequel. It's not really in the same universe. It was just like a subplot that I turned into its own novel. So it's called Letter to My Husband's Mistress, and it's about a the wife of a movie star who finds out her husband is cheating on her, and she writes the mistress a letter, and as the letter goes on, you're seeing the evolution of her thinking, trying to come to terms with the affair, trying to understand who the other woman is. And then you see their lives starting to get intertwined. And I didn't anticipate this when I started it, but it's turning a little bit thrillery-ish at the end. I don't know, can't make promises, but I knew the ending when I started it, but the way that we're getting to the ending is getting a little bit spicy. So we'll see what happens.
That's neat.
Yeah. So I can read a little bit
Yes,
from
please.
that. It's in a Word document, so I'm just okay. So I will my character's name is Estefania. Everybody calls her Fani, and her husband's name is Lucky Laurel. And then the other woman's name is La Paz. I'm not sure if she's addressing this dialogue to La Paz. Lucky and I met in Monterrey in 1952 through our mutual dentist. A very unromantic beginning, I'm afraid. I went in for my annual checkup, and the dentist was very excited, giddy to tell me his next appointment was with a movie star. He dropped his tools repeatedly and nearly gouged the inside of my cheek. I finally begged him to stop and tell me the name of this celebrity with a cracked filling. Lucky Laurel, he said with pride. He's filming a movie in Via de Santiago, and he's apparently in great pain. In fact, he might be in the waiting room right now, so if you don't mind. I feared that man coming near me again with his sharp probe, and so I said, by all means, the actor should have my appointment. I remember I was wearing a green dress, the color of a ripe lime, a ridiculous, starchy thing that made a terrible rustle when I walked. It made me feel like a stuffed parrot. I walked out into the waiting room, determined, absolutely set on keeping my chin high and my eyes fixed on the exit door. I was too afraid to know if Senor Laurel, who had recently starred in a rock and roll picture my father would have forbidden me to watch, but which was advertised all over the city with Lucky's perfect smile at the center of every poster, would notice me, look up, or perhaps in my boldest dreams smile. I took 3 steps, left, right, left, before I heard a small exclamation and turned in horror. In my nervous haste and in the abominable skirt, I had upset a small vase of flowers that was sitting on a low table, spilling water and zinnias all over the startled Lucky. Senorita, he said, jumping up and brushing his pants, which were already darkened in a very inopportune place. I must thank you. Where I'd assumed he would rightly call me a clumsy fool, his face bore no trace of resentment. No, he addressed me as though we'd merely bumped elbows reaching for the same slice of cake. It was so surprising. He continued, "You've given me the only distraction I've had from the pain in my mouth." And then he held out his hand to take mine, and I presented it, gloved in white cotton and trembling. He brought it to his lips for a kiss, the heat of which I can still feel all these years later. He introduced himself as I tried in vain to suppress a fierce blush coloring me from cheeks to clavicle. I murmured my name and mucho gusto, and then escaped through the office door before my heart exploded from the terror of being noticed by someone so bewitching. Lucky has this ability through the way he inclines himself towards you while he speaks, and the way he holds your gaze with a look that's at once wholly innocent and utterly penetrating, of creating a cocoon for only you and him, wrapping you up like a spider binds its victim, only you're so thrilled to be caught, because inside you're the only 2 people in the world, and out of all the multitudes of willing women, he chose you. I remember remember closing the door to the dentist's office and standing there on the street, shaking and holding my hand to my heart, the very hand he'd just brushed with his lips, and thanking God for getting me out of there before I could embarrass myself any further.
That's great.
Wow, yes.
Really great. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for
Yes.
having me. This has been lots of fun.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's been fun for us, yes.
So, and thank all of you for coming. And if you'd like to get some of Elizabeth Gonzalez James's books, please go to our bookstore. That is bookshop.org/shop/Drake Arts. And we'd also like to take a moment to thank all of our generous donors for making this program possible. If you'd like to be a sponsor or donor yourself, please go to drakeatarts.com/donate. To receive more information about our Arts Saturdays and other programs, please email us at drakeatarts@gmail.com or visit our website. That's drakeatarts.com. This and all our programs are archived on the Drake It Arts YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@DrakeItArts. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.